Esther agrees with her uncle Mordecai that she has been brought to the kingdom as queen for such a time as this, to save God's people. Haman hatches a plot, but it backfires big time, and Paul pens another corrective letter to the Corinthians. Today on 3-in-1, as we consider Esther chapters 4 through 6 and 2 Corinthians chapter 1. Well, welcome to our 150th episode here at 3-in-1. In our last episode, we looked at the first 3 chapters of Esther and the last chapter of 1 Corinthians. So today, we will look at the next 3 chapters in Esther and the first chapter of 2 Corinthians. Got all that? Good, because here we go. Mordecai had heard of Haman's plot, and so he sent word to Esther to use her proximity to the king to intercede for her people. And initially, Esther was none too happy about the idea. She wrote back to Mordecai saying, "All the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that any man or woman who goes into the inner court to the king who has not been called, he has but one law, put all to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter that he may live. Yet I myself have not been called to go into the king these 30 days. Now Mordecai, Esther says, there's a 50-50 chance that I'm going to lose my life in this. But here's how Mordecai responds to Esther in verse 13 of chapter 4. Mordecai told them to answer Esther, "Do not think in your heart that you will escape in the king's palace any more than all the other Jews. For if you remain completely silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" Sometimes we need this kind of exhortation, to see things as they really are, and to do what we know is right. So Esther responds in verse 16 of chapter 4, "Go, gather all the Jews who are present in Shushan, and fast for me. Neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. My maids and I will fast likewise, and so I will go to the king, which is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." Man, that's awesome. And in chapter 5, Esther risks it all and enters in unannounced to the king's presence. And it says she found favor in his sight. So much favor that the king says, "Ask what you like, even up to half the kingdom." And Esther asks for dinner with Haman, and the plot thickens. Haman finds out about this invitation, and he's so blinded by pride that he goes home to brag about it. But once he gets home, he finds no joy in the invite, since Mordecai still hasn't bowed down to him. So to console him, his family and his friends suggest that Haman build the gallows that he's going to hang Mordecai from to make him feel better somehow. Verse 14 of chapter 5, "Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, 'Let a gallows be made, 50 cubits high, and in the morning suggest to the king that Mordecai be hanged on it. Then go merrily with the king to the banquet.' And so the thing pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made." Man. Now, remember when we read that Mordecai's reporting the plot to kill the king was recorded in the King's Chronicles? Well, in chapter 6, we found out that one night the king couldn't sleep. So he had the Chronicles brought in to be read to him, to hopefully fall asleep once again. And when they got to the part about Mordecai, the king asked, "Did we do anything special for that guy? No? Well, we should." So the king decreed that Mordecai be led around the kingdom on horseback with a royal robe, with a prince in front of him, proclaiming, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." And guess who the king picked to lead Mordecai around? Haman. Ha! Wow! Haman must have been out of his mind with rage at this point. But none of man's plans will prosper against the providence of God. And even Haman's wife knew this. In chapter 6, verses 13 and 14, we read this today. "When Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him, his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, 'If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish descent, you will not prevail against him, but will surely fall before him.' And while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs came and hastened to bring Haman to the banquet which Esther had prepared." Oh, on the heels of this most infuriating day for Haman, Haman is hastened to the banquet where he hopes to be honored. Now, will that be the case? Well, I guess you'll just have to read to find out. Okay, On to our New Testament reading for today. A new book of the Bible, but a continuation of correspondence with the Corinthians called 2 Corinthians. Now, 1 Corinthians was corrective and instructive, and surely the Corinthians read Paul's letter, right? And they implemented all of his corrections, right? And his instructions immediately, right? Well, that's actually partially true, for we will read right away in chapter 2 that they were obedient to Paul's exhortation to discipline the man who was defiling himself and his stepmom. In verse 6 of chapter 2 it says, "This punishment, which was inflicted by the majority, is sufficient for such a man, so that on the contrary you ought rather to forgive and comfort him, lest perhaps such a one be swallowed up with too much sorrow. Therefore I urge you to reaffirm your love to him. For to this end I also wrote, that I might put you to the test, whether you are obedient in all things." So, that's good. The people responded in obedience. They did the tough stuff as far as discipline was concerned. But as we've seen time and time again, whenever the people of God arise to build, the enemies of God arise to tear down. And this time, what the enemies of God tried to tear down was the Apostle Paul's credibility. And this is such a ridiculously common tactic. If I do not want to receive the content of the message, all I have to do is question the credibility of the messenger. And that's so basic to fallen human nature. Someone speaks the truth to us, and the truth cuts to the core of the issue. And then we somehow defensively respond, "Who are you to tell me? Who do you think you are?" And so in 2 Corinthians, Paul has to go through the extremely uncomfortable and extremely unfortunate thorough defense of his own credibility. For the sake of those he's charged to minister to, Paul defends his ministry. And you can almost hear the agony in his voice when we read some of these verses. It's like fingernails on the chalkboard for him to have to defend himself. But for the cause of Christ and the benefit of the believers that he was ministering to, Paul felt that it was absolutely necessary. And I guess I could say that I'm thankful for it. For in this letter, we have not only Paul's thorough defense of his ministry, but also throughout this letter, interspersed within, there are some exceptionally rich nuggets of truth. And many of these nuggets of truth have to do with glorifying God in the midst of suffering. And we encounter that in this first chapter that we read today. In verse 3, we read, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our tribulation, that we may be able to comfort those who are in any trouble, with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted by God. For as the sufferings of Christ abound in us, so our consolation also abounds through Christ." Now, listen to that in the Living Bible. What a wonderful God we have. He is the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the source of every mercy, and the one who so wonderfully comforts and strengthens us in our hardships and trials. And why does he do this? So that when others are troubled, needing our sympathy and encouragement, we can pass on to them this same help and comfort that God has given us. You can be sure that the more we undergo sufferings for Christ, the more he will shower us with his comfort and encouragement.